From its establishment in 1907 to 1936, the Tata Iron and Steel Company basically was the Indian steel industry. We overlook it today, but steel is the skeleton of our industrialized society. A country cannot industrialize without it. The founder of Tata Steel fervently believed, correctly, that if India had the steel, then it would get the gold. Thus, for the better part of a century, he and the rest of the Tata family doggedly pursued their vision of India's very own domestic steel industry. In this video, we're going to talk about the rise of one of India's most iconic corporations, the Tata Iron and Steel Company, or just Tata Steel. But first, I want to remind you about the newsletter. Check out the newsletter to read the entire scripts for previously released videos, including those you might not have seen before. The sign-up link is in the video description below. I try to put one out every week, maybe two. Alright, back to the show. Jamsetji Nusawanji Tata. I will henceforth refer to him as JN, and please forgive me for butchering his name as well as all the others to come, was born in 1839 to a family of Parsi priests in the western Indian state of Gujarat. He went to Bombay at the age of 14 and received a formal Western education at Elphinstone College. After graduating, he joined his father's trading firm and proved to be quite capable. The trading firm sent JN to Hong Kong and Shanghai to set up branches there. He lived there for 3 years, learning about the Far East. In 1868, JN started a trading company in the city of Bombay, now Mumbai, at the age of 29 with 21,000 rupees of capital. Then, in 1877, JN bought a failed mill and turned it around, eventually creating the textile empire Empress Mills, named as such because Queen Victoria became the Empress of India on that very day. Empress grew to employ several thousand people, and by the 1890s, Tata had become a very wealthy man. One might have expected such a man to spend the rest of his days growing that wealth. But JN was at his heart a nationalist, traveling the world for India's industrial advancement, and over time he came to believe that India needed 3 things to reach its full industrial potential: knowledge, hydroelectric power, and steel. The craftsmen of India were pioneers in smelting iron. There is some archaeological evidence of iron smelting in India as far back as the year 1600 BC, but it most definitely established itself there by 1300 BC. The defeated King Porus is said to have gifted 100 talents of Indian iron to the conqueror Alexander the Great after losing the Battle of the Hydaspes. And classic Indian literature is full of steel swords, spears, and other weapons, like the ancient Sanskrit epic Mahabharata, and the character Bhima's iron mace. There is also Wootz steel, a crucible steel adorned with distinctive bands. The steel held a high reputation throughout the ancient world. But perhaps the mightiest monument to the Indian people's long iron-working heritage is the famous Iron Pillar of Delhi. Nearly 24 feet high and weighing 6 tons, it is famous for having never rusted after 1,800 plus years. A replica was placed in one of Tata Steel's first factories. Most of this early iron was produced using traditional small-scale furnaces. These old ways are not forgotten. They're still practiced to this day in certain villages. However, these small furnaces were inefficient. You cannot use artisan steel to build your rails, bridges, and homes. The fantastic Substack Construction Physics discusses the math. Just creating a kilogram of iron would take 15 kilograms of charcoal, which in turn requires 105 kilograms of wood. To turn that iron into steel, we need yet another 20 kilograms of charcoal, or 140 kilograms of wood. So all in all, about 250 kilograms of wood plus days of physical labor for 1 kilogram of steel. Steel is an amazing metal, flexible, powerful, and durable. JN was right, but if India wanted the steel, it needed to upgrade the way it made that steel. The first attempt to modernize the country's iron and steel industry happened in 1814. A British national named Andrew Duncan tried to start an iron and steel venture on the Mirakashi River in West Bengal. However, they had trouble sourcing raw materials and it failed. Over a decade and a half later, in 1830, comes along Josiah Marshall Heath, who experienced some better success. A former civil servant, he proposed to the East India Company a steel plant on the coast of what is now Chennai. This plant would use European science principles to produce steel cheaper than Russia's or Sweden's. The government gave Heath money, a 21-year monopoly, and exclusive rights over a large iron ore deposit. The Porto Novo Iron Works was India's only large-scale iron and steel factory in the 1830s. While some of its product was good enough for export to Britain, the quality was inconsistent. Suffering constant losses, the East India Company took over the ironworks in 1849, and Heath returned to Britain. The factory ran for a few more years before shutting down. In the 1840s, the Indian colonial government started to expand the country's railways network. The initial effort came at the behest of Lord Dalhousie, who felt that it can promote trade and military efficiency. Railways also encouraged India's formidable coal mining and export industry, but they also required a great deal of steel, which had to be imported from abroad. To meet this demand, the Bengal Iron Works Company was founded in 1874. Located near the famous Raniganj coal fields, the company had 2 blast furnaces producing a high of 14,600 tons of pig iron each year. However, the company failed to reach sufficient scale. In 1875, pig iron from the Bengal Iron Works cost about 65 rupees, 5 rupees more than what British imports cost. After this, the British improved their cost structure even more, vastly undercutting the plant's prices, resulting in its closing in 1879. A few years later, in 1882, the Indian colonial government thus asked the German geologist and metallurgist Ritter von Schwarz to write a post-mortem of the venture. Von Schwartz's report suggested that Bengal failed because it lacked automation methods for reducing labor costs, as well as easy access to raw materials. His report also proposed that its blast furnace capacity be doubled from its previous maximum of 14,600 tons to 29,200 tons, 6% of India's total iron demand at the time, in order to reach sufficient scale. This report eventually made its way to the then 43-year-old J.N. Tata. After reading about them in the report, J.N. decided to head over to the high-quality iron ore deposits in the Lahara area in the Indian state of Maharashtra. He wanted to see if he could receive a concession from the government to work the mines and start his own steel factory. As the report indicated, the iron ore was indeed quite good. However, the coking coal, a necessary ingredient to turn pig iron into finished steel, was not industrial grade. Furthermore, the government did not allow Tata to acquire a mining concession, nor would they grant him access to the railways leading up to any such mine. And then there were the mining regulations, described at the time as being, and I quote, carefully devised to obstruct and prevent development. This lack of government support meant that JN had to abandon his idea for now. Internal and external factors, however, eventually pushed the government to change its attitude. The Indian colonial government was the country's biggest consumer of iron and steel, using it to produce new railways, bridges, and the such. But importing all that steel soon became very challenging. The Indian rupee was a silver-backed currency. After several leading European countries adopt the gold standard in the 1870s, the price of gold rose against silver. This silver weakness, combined with a fall in opium exports to China, caused the rupee to depreciate some 30% throughout the 1880s and 1890s. A weaker rupee simultaneously made steel imports more expensive and inflated the colonial government's pound-denominated debts. Suddenly, domestic steel became much more economically compelling. There are other changes, too. The British steel industry reversed their previous resistance against domestic Indian steel. They were losing competitiveness against the Americans and believed that setting up shop in India would help lower costs. And then there were the pressures from the emerging Indian nationalist movements. The British colonial government was perceived as not having generated sufficient employment for the expanding middle class. Such a failure had political implications. These pressures eventually encouraged the colonial government to change. In the 1890s, the government redirected its purchases to favor domestic steel. It also reformed its previously prohibitive restrictions on mining, paving the way for Tata Steel's creation. By 1899, the government was ready to accept a domestic Indian steel industry. Now they just needed someone to actually go and start one. Several European capitalists declined because of the business risk, preferring the safer profits of trade or cotton. In the end, JN stepped forward as the best candidate after a 1900 trip to London in which he met with and received the semi-endorsement of George Hamilton, the Secretary of State. After Tata returned to India, he and his newly formed Tata Iron and Steel Company once again applied for the mining licenses and received them. In another sign of the times, the government agreed to build a new railway line to the ore mine, as well as to buy 20,000 tons of steel rail each year, provided that they can price and quality match British imports. JN at first put his nephew Shapurji Saklatvala in charge of Tata Iron and Steel. Saklatvala was a talented politician, but probably wasn't the best candidate to run a capitalist enterprise, who would later join the Communist Party of Great Britain. So in 1902, JN traveled the world from Dusseldorf to Pittsburgh for a qualified expert to run his company. There he found Julian Kennedy, Charles Page Perrin, and C.M. Weld, experts in geology, engineering, and metallurgy. Perrin recalls his interview. A stranger in a strange garb entered. He walked in, leaned over my desk, and looked at me for fully a minute in silence. Finally, he said in a deep voice, "Are you Charles Page Perrin?" I said yes. He stared at me again silently for a long time. Then slowly he said, "I believe I have found the man I have been looking for. Julian Kennedy has written you that I am going to build a steel plant in India. I want you to come to India with me to find suitable iron ore and coking coal and the necessary fluxes. I want you to take charge as my consulting engineer. Mr. Kennedy will build the plant wherever you advise, and I will foot the bill. Will you come to India with me?" Perrin, of course, said yes. In April 1903, C.M. Weld arrived at India to prospect for iron ores. With help from the pioneering Indian geologist P.N. Bose, Weld discovered massive iron ore deposits at Durg District and Goruma Hisani Hill, eventually to be some of the world's best. J.N. did not live to see his final dream realized. His health deteriorating, he passed away in May 1904 whilst on a business trip to Germany as Weld and his team prospected. Leadership passed to Saklavala, Weld, and his son Dorabji Tata, Dorab for short. For the coking coal, several coal companies offered to sell it to them, but at Perrin's advice, Tata decided to attain their own coal property and open their own mine. This decision would play a big role in Tata's eventual success. They placed Tata Iron and Steel's first factory near a village named Sakchi on the confluence of the Karkai and Subaraneka rivers. The location offered plentiful water and transportation options via river. In 1907, Tata Steel was officially registered. In this early start, the factory had 2 blast furnaces capable of producing 160,000 tons of pig iron annually and 4 40-ton stationary steel furnaces with capacity of 100,000 tons of steel annually. The plant would eventually employ 175 foreigner managers, 2,000 operating crew, and 6,000 laborers. The capital requirements were immense, forcing them to turn to the markets. With the London market at a bad time, the company turned to the Indian domestic market and raised 232,000 rupees, or about 1.5 million GBP, from some 8,000 shareholders. The stock sales were a testament to the value of the Tata brand name. The Tata offices had people lining up with stools and lunch boxes like concert goers waiting for Blackpink tickets. That being said, large industrialists, personal friends of the Tata family, bought the majority of the shares. This remained the case for many years. A 1966 study found that 63 shareholders out of 11,000 plus total owned 43% of the shares. With funding secured, work began in February 1908. The work was challenging. The company not only had to plan and build this factory, but also the city around it. Back then, Sakchi was heavily forested with no roads or railways. John Keenan, future general manager, was an early arrival to the village. He recalled that the construction disturbed local elephants and tigers, the latter of which killed 2 laborers. People were afraid to leave their tents at night. Regardless, the city rose up. 3 years later, in 1911, there were streets of 1-story brick houses equipped with running water and electricity. The factory fired up for the first time in December 1911, and the first pig iron ingots rolled off the line in 1912. The blast furnaces produced enough cheap pig iron to export to customers like Japan's Mitsui. 40 to 60% of the cost of pig iron comes from the raw materials, a demonstration of Tata's logistical expertise and foresight in vertically integrating their supply chain. In 1913, the Indian colonial government started placing their first steel railways orders. But such sales faced early challenges. The core issue was that of quality. The colonial government said that it would only buy Indian steel if it matched the quality standards of its British imports, a standard referred to as the British Standard Specifications in Steel. This in turn affected the private railway companies' buying choices as well. Such standards were unusually strict. Railway companies in India had higher quality requirements than those in the US or even Britain itself. Furthermore, available steel imports from European countries like Belgium or Germany didn't have to meet the same British standards. This contributed to an impression of unfairness, and it perhaps was, but it also forced Tata Steel to upgrade their competence. In 1913, with government inspectors rejecting some 37% of steel ingot production by tonnage, things came to a head. Tata Steel management came across a draft circular from the India office about the issue, hinting that the government might rescind its previous 20,000-ton annual purchase commitment. Tata Steel took the message to heart. They set up, at their own expense, a government chemical laboratory for testing, and hired British staff, replacing previously Indian and American staffers. They cost more, but had more experience with British steel standards. This succeeded. By the 1920s, over 90% of Tata Steel's rail product met tested British standards. The quality issues might have been overcome, but Tata still struggled to match the financial scale of the American steel giants, mostly due to low labor productivity. Then came World War I. With Europe embroiled in conflict, continental imports to India, including those from Belgium and especially Germany, collapsed. Net imports in 1914/15 was 746,000 tons. From 1915 to 1916, just 365,000 tons. Supply collapsed, but demand remained robust, causing prices to soar. The war effort ended up taking 80% of the company's production. Indian steel products were exported to various theaters of war in Egypt and East Africa. Profit margins grew from 16% in 1914 to 39% in 1917. But the company also suffered higher input costs. Prices for coal rose 228% and iron ore 258%. Not to mention, the 26-plus merchant supply ships carrying Tata goods sunk by submarine warfare. Tata participated in the war effort with honor. In all, Tata provided 300,000 tons of steel throughout the war's 4 years. That steel was of high quality. Not a single ton of steel shell was rejected. Furthermore, the steel was sold at half the market price, thanks to a fixed-price contract sealed with the production board shortly after the war's start. After the war, Lord Chelmsford, Viceroy of India, came to Sakchi and toured the area in 1919, proclaiming its renaming to Jamshedpur. He told the people, "I can hardly imagine what we should have done during these 4 years of war if the Tata Company had not been able to give us steel rail for Mesopotamia, Egypt, Palestine, and East Africa, and I have come to give my thanks." The war raised Tata Steel's profile and buffered its financials, but the new peace held an uneasy future for management. 1920 was calm, but 1921 saw an abrupt steel glut situation, with world steel production capacity 20% over demand. In Britain, 81 of Scotland's 102 steel furnaces were shut down. European steelmakers in Belgium started dumping their steel into the Indian markets. Bar steel prices crashed from a high of 309 rupees per ton in April 1920 to 164 rupees in June 1924. Prices continued to decline throughout the decade. The post-war recession brought a stronger rupee, expensive cost inputs, and labor unrest in Tata's 20,000-strong workforce stemming from new productivity systems. Worse yet, it caught Tata in the midst of a massive capital expansion of the plant to enlarge the furnaces, upgrade the steelmaking technology, and improve labor productivity, the Great Extension Scheme. Gross profit fell from some 9 million rupees in 1921/22 to just 2.1 million in 1922/23. With the sole exception of 1926, Tata Steel stock didn't pay dividends in the 13 years from 1922 to 1935. The stock price accordingly cut in half. Tata Steel management turned to the colonial government. In their eyes, Tata Steel had done a service during the war by selling steel at below market prices. Now it was time to return the favor. Thus, in 1924, the colonial government diverged from its traditional laissez-faire policy and imposed protective tariffs on steel, the first such to protect an Indian industry. These tariffs also came partly at the behest of rising Indian nationalism. They also opened up sensitive questions about India's relations with Britain, as tariffs were lower on British imports than those from the rest of the world. This concept of imperial preference became a major discussion point in these years. Even with these protections, Dorab Tata at one point had to pledge his entire fortune, including his wife's jewelry, to secure the money to make payroll. But the tariffs benefited the company an estimated 5 to 7 million rupees in annual revenue throughout the 1920s. In the 1930s, Tata Steel completed their upgrades and resolved their labor productivity issues by instituting new systems of employment. During this decade, Tata Steel flourished, with gross profits hitting 40%. India achieved near self-sufficiency in certain steel products. It should be said that Tata and the rest of the Indian steel industry missed a ripe opportunity in the 1930s to invest more in capacity and possibly build an export business, opting instead to pay out big dividends. Oh well, nothing's perfect. In 1938, Jahangir Gandhi succeeded John Keenan as Tata Steel's general manager, the first Indian to take up the job. The company can now said to be fully Indian, and on the eve of World War II, which would bring another round of prosperity, it would have the largest integrated steel plant in the British Empire. The 100-year rise of India's domestic steel industry began in 1830 with a failed factory. It concludes with a globally competitive, leading-edge steel giant. Tata Steel remains a giant to this day, and its parent Tata Group, one of the world's biggest and most respected conglomerates. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the newsletter, and I'll see you guys next time.